Today's hearing is titled Understanding the Impact of U.S. Policy Changes on Human Rights and Democracy in Cuba. And I want to begin by welcoming Assistant Secretary of State for the Western Hemisphere, Roberta Jacobson, and Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, Tom Malinowski. We appreciate your service to our country and your attendance here today. I'd like to note that the committee invited two other administration witnesses to appear today. They were the reported negotiators of this deal with the Castro government, Mr. Ben Rhodes and Mr. Ricardo Zuniga from the National Security Council. Unfortunately, the White House counsel's office informed us that they would not be allowed to testify at this hearing. And I find this concerning given the fact that these are the two individuals who the administration put forward in negotiating the deal. But we'll move forward from there. We have two excellent panels today. The first, of course, is the official panel that you see seated and ready to go. And then we're going to hear from a number of human rights activists, democracy activists on the island of Cuba who will talk to us about the changes. Let me preface this by saying that I believe every member of this committee this morning, as I do the vast majority of Americans and policymakers, share the goals of democracy and freedom on the island of Cuba. In fact, the administration, in announcing this policy, stated that the purpose of this new policy is to support the Cuban people to freely determine their own future, to freely determine their political future, and by that I take it to mean democracy, which we all share, and also to freely determine their economic future. I would point out that a free Cuban people have a right to choose any economic model they want, although there's one that I would suggest. It is up to them to choose that future. So this is a goal we all share. And the question for us here today as we review these policy changes is how effective will these policy changes be in bringing about this shared goal? And so today we're going to analyze both the process by which this arrangement was arrived at, and we're also going to talk about how effective these policies may or may not be in achieving the stated goals. I think it is no secret, and I have publicly stated, that I have deep reservations and, in many instances, direct opposition to many of the changes that we're here today that we're going to review here today, for the simple reason that I believe that they will not be effective at bringing about the sort of political opening on the island of Cuba that all of us desire for the Cuban people. You know, the Cuban people are the only people in this hemisphere that have not had a free and fair election in the last decade and a half. They deserve the right to have that just like any other people do. They are no less deserving of freedom and democracy than the people of Guatemala, Honduras, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, and a host of other nations, all of whom, at some point over the last decade, have at least once had the ability to freely choose their leaders. And the notion that somehow we should be more patient with Cuba than all these other societies is, quite frankly, unfair and offensive. And so the goal of this hearing here today is to understand these changes, to understand, first of all, how it came about, what was the process by which they was negotiated, and second, how effective could these policies be in effectuating the change that we all want for the island of Cuba. Right, so let me begin. Secretary Jacobson, when did you first learn about these negotiations with regards to change of policy towards Cuba?
Well, I knew throughout the period that there were efforts underway to secure the release of Alan Gross.
When did you know about the policy changes being negotiated?
I knew about the policy changes that accompanied that effort some weeks, probably about a couple of months before they were announced.
In the 2 months that you knew about it, were you involved in the negotiations?
I was not.
Was anybody in the State Department involved in the negotiations?
I can't speak for the Secretary of State. I know that no one in my bureau was involved.
Who were the lead negotiators for the United States?
To the best of my knowledge, they were the NSC personnel that you mentioned at the beginning of the hearing.
Okay. And who were the lead negotiators for the Cuban government? Were they diplomats or members of the military or intelligence?
I don't know that.
Okay. Were you consulted or regularly briefed by the negotiators for your input on the policy changes?
What I can say is that when we were talking about securing the release of Alan Gross, the State Department was in the lead on that part of the Gross detention. We were in the lead on the conditions of confinement. We were on the lead in contacting his family and working with his family.
But what about the policy changes? I think that...
well, there had been a process of looking at potential policy changes with Cuba that had been going on throughout the administration that had brought many agencies together.
Right.
Much of that discussion was the basis for the conversation.
But as the negotiations were ongoing with the two individuals that I've identified who are not here today, were you personally contacted, as the person who's now in charge of making this come about, were you involved in interaction with the negotiators, giving them input and advice during the last 2 months?
In the last 2 months, as we were preparing on the policy changes, I was not.
Okay.
As we were preparing to implement the effect of those changes, I was.
So it's fair to say that this negotiation occurred through NSC personnel. The State Department was not in charge or involved in, unless the Secretary of State was, in providing advice and counsel on negotiating the policy changes.
To the best of my knowledge, most of the preparation on the policy changes had been done through the policy committee that was an interagency policy committee prior to those negotiations. But during that process, we were not.
Okay. Now, Secretary Malinowski, when did you learn about these negotiations on the policy changes?
Like Assistant Secretary Jacobson, I was aware that there were discussions with respect to Alan Gross, but in terms of the policy changes,
Did the negotiators reach out to you as someone in charge of the human rights portfolio for the State Department for a suggestion on who should be on the list of the 53 political prisoners?
we were involved in every conversation interagency about political prisoners in Cuba, about who.
But were you consulted on who the 53 or what the list should be and who should be picked?
The list was based on inputs that were provided over time by Cuban civil society organizations.
Were you consulted?
Not personally, but I can tell you that they asked for exactly the right people to be released.
Which civil society groups in Cuba or opposition figures were consulted, to the best of your knowledge, about the list?
There are a number of Cuban civil society organization senators you know who document who is in prison in Cuba for the peaceful exercise of their political views. All of those lists from a variety of human rights organizations were consulted and incorporated, and the list was exactly the right list.
So the administration, during these negotiations, consulted with civil society in Cuba about who should be on the list?
We have been consulting as an administration for years with Cuban civil society and human
But
rights
specifically with
organizations.
regards to these negotiations, were groups within Cuba consulted and asked who should be the people that are on the list, who should we prioritize, what's the status of each individual on the list?
Not specifically with respect to the negotiations, which, as we all know.
Just in general.
But in general, we based our knowledge of who is in prison in Cuba on their work.
Secretary Jacobson, that takes me back to another question. Which civil society groups in Cuba were in the loop, so to speak, who were consulted during the process of this negotiation? I know you were not involved, but subsequently you've talked to some of them. Which groups within Cuba, which pro-democracy groups which in Cuba were aware of these negotiations and consulted about the subject matter of the negotiations during the negotiations?
I think you probably have to ask some of those groups, but to the best of my knowledge, we continued to consult with those groups throughout that period through our interest section and through Tom and my work in the Bureau, as we always consult with them. But as part of the negotiations, I don't know that any were specifically consulted. The input that we get through our interest section and through our own work was certainly known to the negotiators.
Okay, let's talk about something you are involved in negotiating now. You traveled to Havana last week, the week before.
The week
The
before.
lead negotiator for the Cubans is an individual by the name of Josefina Vidal, correct? You've known her, you've interacted with her in the past.
Yes.
You find her to be, as you said, a serious person, someone,
Yes.
okay. And so when she speaks, you take what she says with some level of authority and seriousness. I mean, she obviously has some level of authority from the government to be at that table and speak on their behalf.
Yes.
Okay. I wanted to ask you about yesterday. She has a statement. It says, Cuba's lead negotiator said in an interview broadcast on state television that if the United States want free movement for its diplomats in Cuba, it must stop using them to support the political opposition. This is her quote. The way those diplomats, meaning the U.S., act should change in terms of stimulating, organizing, training, supplying, and financing elements within our country that act against the interests of the government of the Cuban people. The total freedom of movement, which the U.S. side is posing, is tied to a change in the behavior of its diplomatic mission and its officials, end quote. Would we accept an embassy in Cuba where our diplomats are not allowed to meet with democracy activists on the island?
We would not curtail the activities we're doing now, which is meeting with democracy
But
activists. And
one of the things
so-
that we're trying to negotiate is opening an embassy in Cuba.
Correct.
And she's saying, in order for us to open an embassy in Cuba, and as you've said, she's a serious person who speaks with authority, she's made very clear yesterday that in order for us to open an embassy in Cuba and allow our personnel greater freedom than they have now, we would have to agree not to allow them to interact with democracy activists. Is that a condition? Can you categorically say today we will never accept that condition on our personnel?
What I can say is that I don't yet know whether that's a real condition on their part, but we could not accept that condition.
What do you mean
if
it's not a
were.
real condition? You
Well,
just
I
said
think-
she's a serious person who speaks with authority on behalf of the government.
I also think that sometimes things are said in public that are not necessarily a position in private, and I don't know that they have made that a condition yet.
But in
You
fact,
have
that is
to
their
ask
position
them.
in public today, is it not?
I saw what she said in public, but what
But
I'm
in
saying
practice,
is
that's their condition.
we could not accept not meeting with democracy activists and with the broadest swath of Cubans possible. That's the point of this policy.
My time is
So,
up, and I want to
yes.
get to Senator Boxer. I guess what I'm trying to get today is the following. Can you say today to people watching this broadcast and here in the audience and to the members of this committee that under no circumstances will the United States ever agree to limit the ability of our personnel to interact with democracy activists and civil society in Cuba as a condition of expanding our embassy operation?
We want to have the greatest possible ability to interact with everybody, including democracy activists all over the island. That's the point of our getting the geographic restrictions lifted.
So we will never agree with the Cuban government that in order to open an embassy, we will agree to limit our personnel.
We're going to keep pushing to get those restrictions lifted as part of getting an embassy. in
Secretary
Cuba.
Jacobson, it's a pretty straightforward question. Would we ever agree in a negotiation to the Cubans that in order to open an embassy, we will agree not to send our people to meet with democracy activists? Yes or no? Will we ever agree to that?
I can't imagine that we would go to the next stage of our diplomatic relationship with an agreement not to see democracy activists, no.
Okay. But I wanted to begin basically with the following, and I'll focus on this. You talk about travel as a key component of this plan because you believe the benefits of travel to the island, to the Cuban people, outweigh the benefits to the government. So in Cuba, the largest owner of tourist facilities is a group it's called Grupo de Turismo Gaviota. Recently, Hotel Magazine called it the largest hotel conglomerate in Latin America. In Cuba, they own well over 52 hotels and the largest resorts on the island, 19,000 rooms. Their revenues are estimated at over $650 million a year. They plan 47,000 rooms by the year 2017. They also own marinas, car rentals, restaurants, you name it. They are the single largest player, not just in Cuba, but in Latin America. The CEO of that company is an individual by the name of General Luis Perez Rospide. He's also a general in the armed forces. Mr. Malinowski, let me ask you, is the armed forces of Cuba a tool of repression?
Yes.
Okay. So the CEO of this company that owns all these hotels on the island is also a general of this repressive government. But this company, Gaviota, is actually owned by a larger company, a holding company by the name of Gaesa, G-A-E-S-A. Gaesa it owns various companies, including this one, but basically it has a monopoly on the island of Cuba on telecommunications, hotels, restaurants, shops, and gas stations. The CEO of the holding company that owns all of these hotels is an individual by the name of Luis Alberto Rodriguez Lopez Calleja. That's not just an individual with a long name. He is also a general in the repressive armed forces. Do you know who he's married to, Ms. Jacobson, Secretary?
No.
He's married to a lady by the name of Deborah Castro Espin. Do you venture to guess who that is?
I can venture a guess that it's a member of the Castro family.
It is. It is actually Raul Castro's daughter. So the CEO of the monopoly holding company in Cuba that owns all of these hotel rooms, the single largest conglomerate in Latin America of tourism, is not just a general in the repressive military, he is also the son-in-law of the dictator of Cuba. So isn't it fair to say that if tomorrow an American gets on an airplane and travels to Cuba and stays at a hotel and rents a car and fills up the tank of their rental car at a gas station and eats at a restaurant and shops at its stores, in essence, every penny they're spending in those facilities are more likely than not to wind up in the hands of the repressive Cuban military and its officials? Is that not a fair statement, given the facts I've just given you here?
Let me try to address that, Senator Rubio. As somebody I was born in a communist country, and I've been studying these systems all my life. And what you just described is a common feature of every repressive, corrupt, communist or otherwise totalitarian system in the world. When you actually look at the numbers, you find that these hotels that they run, these businesses that they run, they earn hard currency, but they also seep hard currency because they run them inefficiently, and that's why they fail. So we actually don't know, none of us know, exactly what the net is.
But whatever the net is.
But whatever the net is, in all of my experience advocating human rights, and as someone who often supports targeted sanctions against the bad guys, I know of no example where we have successfully promoted democratic change somewhere by going after travel and tourism, by going after little people who travel and interact with each other. When we do go after people with those kinds of measures, we go up after people at the top.
Give me an example of a policy like this that you're implementing here today that has led in the 20th or 21st century into a reluctant tyranny becoming a democracy.
I can't think of any policy that we have successfully pursued in which we have gone after remittances and travel. There are plenty of situations where we've used diplomatic engagement. Sometimes we use diplomatic engagement plus sanctions, as we did in Burma. But we didn't do it this way. We did it in a smarter way. This is a policy that's modeled on...
Is there an example of a country in the modern era that has gone from a tyranny to a dictatorship because of these sorts of economic openings that then have led the government to make political changes?
In many ways, when I look at Cuba today, it reminds me of my home country, Poland, in the 1980s, where you have a growing black market, fed by growing interaction with the outside world, with a movement at home that was backed by strong moral pressure from the United States and the international community, and a state that was increasingly corrupt and shrinking all of the time because it couldn't manage any of this. So yes, I think the answer is yes.
So Poland is the example. We'll examine that further at a later date.